Coming up after the break, regime change from Iran to, I don't know, Belarus. Don't miss it. Welcome back to Sputnik. Imagine, if you will, a pebble thrown in a pond as long ago as 1953, which is still causing tidal waves today. Actually, you don't have to imagine it, for that is precisely what happened when Britain and the United States and others plotted and succeeded in overthrowing the democratically elected Iranian Prime Minister, Dr. Mossadegh, replacing him with the Shah. No Shah, no Ayatollah Khomeini. No Ayatollah Khomeini, no Iraq-Iran wars. No Iraq-Iran wars, perhaps no Gulf wars. And, of course, the reverberations continue, and not just between Iran and Iraq. The entire region of the Middle East, the most strategically important in the world, for now at least, is still shaking as a result of that pebble thrown in 1953. A man who knows all about these plots and plans is Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News, and I'm delighted to welcome him back on board the Sputnik. Joe, we now know from new revelations just how deeply the British were involved in the coup against Mossadegh. Most of us took comfort from the fact, if comfort is the right word, that it was your country, the United States, that did most of the heavy lifting. But that wasn't entirely true, was it?
No, it was very much a British coup, wasn't it? And in fact, it was interesting that these revelations showed that the Truman administration was not interested, that they did not agree, excuse me, with Britain, that the communists, the Russians, would eventually take over. When there was one Tudor party member, that's the Iranian Communist Party, in Mossadegh's government. So it was only, in fact, in February of 1953, when Alan Dulles was appointed director of the Central Intelligence Agency by the newly elected and inaugurated President Dwight D. Eisenhower, that the Americans went along with the British plot. But it was still very much one. In fact, as we now know, the Shah was not very convinced either of doing this and had to have his sister bribed and sent to Tehran from Paris to talk him into it. And here we saw the Americans eagerly got on board with Dulles. And it was for the U.S. really a reversal of 1776, George, because instead of removing a king to bring in a democratic government, we took out a democratic government and put a king back on the throne. And of course, it was off to the races for the U.S. after that. The following year, Dulles helped organize, of course, the coup in Guatemala, overthrowing another democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz. And of course, the Dulles Brothers Bank had worked with the United Fruit Company, which basically owned almost all the land in the country. The U.S., after the Second World War, and I think the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima that we commemorated just a few weeks ago, the 75th anniversary, created a megalomania in American leaders.
It's interesting that, isn't it? Because the coup in Iran was, quote unquote, successful, it gave them a taste for more. If it had failed, of course it cataclysmically failed in the long term, but if it had failed on the night, as it were, history might have been rather different.
Perhaps, but knowing what we know about Alan Dulles, and as I said, this desire to use the position that America had after the war to maintain and extend its power and overthrow governments, and the drumming up of the threat of the Soviet Union. This is key to all of this. This was in 1949, there was the CIA's first coup in Syria, in which an elected leader was overthrown for a general, again, because they felt the Soviets were going to take over. And this has always been the boogeyman, of course. And in fact, it's nationalism that they were more concerned about, not communism. They dressed it up as communism. Let's look at Ho Chi Minh. He sent 6 letters to Harry Truman, President Truman, asking for U.S. help for Vietnamese independence. They were all went ignored and unanswered. In fact, in his independence speech in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh quoted directly from the American Declaration of Independence, and there was no response. So then, like Castro as well in Cuba, they're sort of driven into the Soviet camp by Americans not wanting any kind of independent country economically or politically. And in Iran, certainly economics played a big role, as you said, It was the nationalization of the Anglo-British oil company there that really spurred the attempt by Britain to overthrow and successfully overthrow Mossadegh. But they didn't want to do it without the Americans, and they finally got their help. So I think even if Iran had failed, I think they would have tried somewhere else, probably in 1954 in Guatemala.
It is interesting that they felt the need to put the lipstick of anti-Sovietism on the face of all this. They didn't, these recent revelations make it clear that that was the pitch, that the Soviets would take over, that the communists were using Mossadegh and would eventually supplant him. But there's no actual evidence for that at all. The evidence is to the contrary. Mossadegh was not a communist. He was not a Soviet agent, any more, as you say, than in the beginning, Ho Chi Minh or Fidel Castro were.
That's right. And the Americans didn't believe that the communists would take over, that the Truman administration. I found the most astounding thing in this new revelation this week in the anniversary of the Iranian coup, that the Americans did not think the Soviets were a threat, even after the 1949 coup, in which they thought the Soviets were some kind of threat in Syria. Now, Russia had occupied parts of Iran right after the war, but they withdrew. So it was really all about the oil company. It's about nationalism. It's about economic and strategic interests, not spreading democracy. If you watched any of that Democratic National Convention this week, we had John Kerry and Colin Powell coming out, and the old tropes about exceptionalism and America spreading democracy. The sad thing, George, I think, is not only do a vast majority of American people believe this or don't have other information, but I think that American leaders and the bureaucracy, many of them believe it themselves.
The points you make rather confound my initial thesis, because if you think about it, if Iran went well and was a success, everything of late has gone extremely badly and turned to ashes in front of their eyes, but that hasn't put them off. You would have thought, I've just been studying the BBC documentary on a 5-parter on the Iraq War. You'd think a simple look at that documentary would say, well, we better not try that kind of thing again. But they have, time after time after time. Is that myopia, madness? What is it?
I think they, for what we see, what normal people would see as a disaster and a failure, in their eyes might be a success. Take Iraq, take Ukraine. They overthrew a democratically elected OSCE certified elected president, Viktor Yanukovych. And what happened? It led to a civil war and killings and still a destabilized Ukraine. But they got their contractors in there, particularly in Iraq. They got the contractors in. They took out the guy they didn't want in there anymore. And chaos might be what they're able to live with, some low-intensity counterinsurgency that can go on and make huge sums of money for contractors, for military industry, and keep out of power someone who would be independent. They'd rather have this kind of bloody chaos than a functioning democratic state that is independent from the U.S., such as Mossadegh would have been, such as Yanukovych wanted to do by going with the Russians rather than the European, such as Allende certainly was doing with his socialist reforms, and Arbenz with his land reforms in Guatemala. They can't stand that. They cannot stand an independent democratic country that's not bothering anybody. They have to meddle, either as a democratic leader or a dictator. They want to meddle if it's not the guy that they want. So I don't think they care, George, to answer your question.
These color revolutions of the last period, of course, are continuing. The events in Belarus are the latest example. A president of an independent country comes up with, from my point of view, a scarcely credible election result. But you wonder what the result of the last election in Saudi Arabia was. Or in Egypt, we hailed the re-election of General Sisi with 97% of the vote. At least Lukashenko restricted it to 70. But an obvious authoritarian leader, strong man, almost certainly manipulated election, and suddenly we look like we're gearing up for another one.
Well, 90% election for Saddam was a problem for the Americans, but 90% for somebody that they don't want to overthrow or they don't care about is fine. So, yes, I think Belarus, I'm glad you pointed out that Lukashenko is not a Democrat. And I think it's important for people who are critical of American meddling and all the things we've been talking about to also recognize that he brought a lot of these problems on himself. There is, I think, legitimate dissent. What happens is the U.S. manipulates and manages that dissent and helps to organize the protests. I think we saw that in Ukraine. There was certainly legitimate protests against the elected leader in Ukraine. I think there's a good deal of industrial action that's going on in Belarus. That's a legitimate dissent against Lukashenko. But you should put that aside. We can hold in our mind two ideas, that the guy's not democratic. He's a strong man, as you say, but also the U.S. could be and very well likely is meddling. And the National Endowment Democracy, as we know from a 1991 article in the Washington Post, is doing the job the CIA openly, what the CIA used to do covertly, which was to destabilize governments that the U.S. didn't like. And the NED has had 34 projects in Belarus over the last year. But what we don't have in Belarus, I should point out that we did have in Ukraine, is American senators like John McCain and the Undersecretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, going right down into the Maidan in Kiev and handing out cookies and speaking and coddling and encouraging the protests. It's extraordinary, George. It would be like the deputy foreign minister in Russia or a huge figure in the Duma going down to Zuccotti Park in 2011 with the Occupy Wall Street and making speeches and handing out cookies there. How would Americans have responded to the Russian ambassador showing up in New York during Occupy Wall Street? That's precisely what happened in Ukraine, but that has not yet happened in Belarus. One reason is the U.S. only had the diplomatic relations restored with Belarus in April of this year. So they only installed now a U.S. ambassador.
Joe Lauria, your Consortium News still doing marvelous work. It's a must-read for me every day. Thanks for joining us again on board the Sputnik.
I appreciate that, George, and thanks for having me on.
Welcome.